I don't know if during that last presentation if you had the same response that I did. When the printer went off, it actually was the same sound that my espresso maker makes. And I noticed this Pavlovian kick of caffeine into my system. And so it was nice. And I see a few folks are getting their coffee. But let me take a few minutes to introduce this session that we have today. As Jane mentioned, my name is Randy Newcomb, and I'm the president and CEO of Humanity United. As Jane explained, I'm the chair of the Modern Day Slavery track during the conference, and will be joining you in two problem-solving working groups over the course of the next 2 days. The first working group is entitled Preventing Modern Day Slavery. This will be held this afternoon at 4 p.m. And the second working group is entitled Improving Data on Modern Day Slavery, and will be held tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. However, before I introduce our speakers today, I want to sharpen the topic that we've come here to discuss during this next hour. While we are gathered here today, more than 20 million boys and girls and men and women are held as slaves around the world. They are represented by young girls weaving high-end rugs in Nepal, or boys stitching soccer balls in Pakistan. They are entire families held in bonded labor in quarries across South Asia. They are women from Eastern Europe trafficked to the West to satisfy the pleasures of others. They are men held captive on massive processing boats plying the fisheries off New Zealand. And they are women and men hustled across the border in the US to harvest agriculture for our daily diet. These and many others will go to bed tonight, neither free or secure in the knowledge that they control even the slightest glimmer of their own destiny. Whereas President Lincoln launched the beginning of the end of slavery in the United States through the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, slavery has continued to flourish in the dark corners of our world today. But just like the philanthropists of the 19th century that provided courage, hope, and resources that enabled the abolitionist movement in the United States, many of us in this room are compelled to answer a call to offer courage, offer hope, and resource a new movement that aims to abolish slavery once and for all around the world. I want to point out something that really interesting that happened last September in 2012. Something really quite remarkable took place. A little less than 45 days before the presidential election in the United States, and in the thick of the campaign, President Obama set aside his campaign message and delivered the longest speech on slavery since Abraham Lincoln's presidency. Before an audience of nearly 3,000 people, much like this, he started his comments with these words. Today, I want to discuss an issue that relates to one of the biggest challenges of the modern era. It ought to concern every person because it's a debasement of our common humanity. It ought to concern every community because it tears at our social fabric. It ought to concern every nation because it endangers public health and fuels violence and organized crime. I'm talking about the injustice, the outrage of human trafficking, which must be called by its true name, modern slavery. Today, I couldn't be more pleased to introduce three distinguished speakers that understand this challenge that President Obama points to. Today, we're joined by Jacquelline Fuller, Director of Google Giving, which provides more than $50 million annually to support tech innovators making transformational impact globally. She joined Google in 2007 to help launch Google.org and directs Google's grantmaking and advocacy in support of sustainability and philanthropic goals. She previously served as Deputy Director of Global Health at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she was a member of the senior management team for 8 years. We're also joined by Ambassador CdeBaca, who was appointed by President Obama to coordinate U.S. government activities in the global fight against slavery. He serves as Senior Advisor to the Secretary of State and directs the State Department's Office to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, which assesses global trends, provides training and technical assistance, and advocates for the end of modern-day slavery. He formerly served as counsel to the House Committee on the Judiciary, where his portfolio included national security, intelligence, immigration, civil rights, and modern slavery issues. And lastly, in addition, we're joined by Pam Omidyar, the founder and chair of the board of Humanity United, which she established in 2005. Humanity United is a private foundation committed to building peace and advancing human freedom by funding, supporting, and collaborating with organizations and individuals that envision a world free of conflict and injustice. As the Foundation's guiding visionary, she was integral in developing Humanity United's mission and values, and is actively engaged in steering its course as board chair. And just as a personal privilege, if I can say, I've had the opportunity now for nearly 12 years to work with the Omidyar family. Pam and I have found ourselves in probably some of the most extreme and complex locations around the world, yet I don't think I've ever come across another individual that is more committed to building peace and advancing freedom in the world that we live in today. So if you would, please welcome our panelists today. Jacqueline, let me turn to you first. And many of us had an opportunity to join with you a week ago tomorrow in Washington, D.C., where Google made a really significant announcement about a new initiative to not only fund a global hotline network, but to get behind building the capacity and supporting that effort. Tell us about that particular project.
Sure. So as you can imagine, at Google, we're big believers in the power of technology. And I think we've all seen how the internet and the web have really driven economic impact around the world. But the very forces that are driving that economic impact, the reduction of friction between people and markets wanting to buy and sell, the ability to sell and move product across borders, the driving of prices lower and lower, all of these, which have been such great forces for economic impact, are also empowering traffickers and enabling human slavery as well. So we need to be very savvy about how we can use technology to counter that. So earlier this week, we announced that Google was going to provide $3 million in the form of one of our Global Impact Awards to 3 heroic organizations who are working day in and day out on the front lines. It's the Polaris Project, La Strada, who work out of Eastern and Western Europe, and Liberty Asia, who's working cross-border in the Mekong Delta area. So basically what we're seeing is, the bad guys, the traffickers, are innovating constantly, and we wanted to empower those who are on the front lines to innovate even faster than the opposition. So, when you hear something like Hotline, that can sound very much like, your grandmother's hotline, but really what we're talking about these are the state-of-the-art systems, so that today, if you're a young girl trafficked and you're being held against your will, the way that you're going to reach out and get in touch with help is through one of these helplines. And then the response is enabled as well. So we wanted to help these groups to use technology. So for example, right now, Brad from Polaris tells a story how sitting down with someone, a young girl who had been trafficked, she holds up the phone to him and says, Brad, you can look through here, and there's text from my pimp controlling me. I get texts and calls from men trying to buy me. And there's absolutely no resources. There's no one here. Where were you? How did I not know that there's help available? So we want to help enable these partners to use the tools of the 21st century. So for example, recently Polaris, which has taken about 72,000 calls in the last few years, and they take these calls and then they work through a network of, in the US alone, it's 2,700 different response units, right? To help build up the technology that's going to enable them to identify who's vulnerable, get a faster and better response, but then also to share the data between these best-in-breed partners so that they can identify trends, so they can understand how are traffickers mutating and reformulating themselves and shifting, and how can we respond to that better. So the system that we're helping to enable is going to allow better, faster response, but also better sharing of intel and better analysis. And I want to say Salesforce and Palantir, 2 other tech companies, came in as well and are providing support through their product.
It really is very innovative. And one of the realities of this particular project that struck me was that the the tendency for many of us to organize and structure programs within sort of national boundaries,
Right.
without recognizing that the function of trafficking transcends boundaries.
Absolutely.
And but what we tend to organize in sort of a way that kind of meets the requirements for regulatory reasons or else otherwise. But what you're introducing in this is really something that transcends those boundaries. And so you're connecting to Southeast Asia, you're connecting to Eastern Europe, and you're connecting a really very successful program in the US. What was your thinking behind that, to really want to transcend those boundaries and develop a far more robust system?
Well, some of the partners are already doing that. So Liberty Asia, for example, has been very good about realizing, these borders are very porous from the trafficker's perspective. So we need to have the response be porous across borders as well. So they're working across the Mekong Delta in various states and entities, because it doesn't do any good to do whack-a-mole with the trafficker set up here and then have it move cross-border and then have the intelligence not move across-border as well. So we are enabling that. And also, sometimes the victims are being moved. So this conversation, the sharing of intelligence, the sharing of data and analysis is also allowing the response systems to make sure that if someone is rescued and freed and provided with aftercare, that they're able to go home, because a lot of times people are moved thousands of miles away from home, and in fact that's part of what makes them more vulnerable and part of what inhibits them from reaching out.
Thank you. Lou, let me turn to you, and you had a hand in helping to shape the president's speech last September, and it really was an interesting moment in time to hear the president really draw such attention to this. One of the values that he pointed to in this speech was the benefit and the value of public, private, and social sector partnerships, and this seems to have actually been a theme of the administration for the past 2 terms. Tell us how that's playing out and what you're seeing from your seat in Washington, D.C. as you see public, private, and social sector partnerships working together across the country and perhaps even globally.
Well, I think that some of it is rethinking the way in which we do grant making, in which we do foreign assistance, in which we try to have impact out in the world. One of the things that, and I mentioned it to Jacqueline as we were coming up, we're thinking much more about trying to be the angel investor. Come to us with a proof of concept, and with, we're not USAID that or the folks that do the narcotics work, who think in millions and billions as far as their grants are concerned. Our average grant is about $300,000. We can go up to about $750 on any particular grant. What we've realized is that if we can go for innovation, not be afraid to fail, look at things that are real game changers, that we can then take that out to the philanthropic community, take it out to other donors, et cetera, and have something that already works. And so if the Nordics or the EU, from the government side, if the UN system or someone else wants to then pick something up and run with it. One of the things I was struck with at the launch last week with the Global Hotline is that Polaris Project, La Strada, and the folks behind Liberty Asia are all grantees, former grantees of my office. We're able to incubate the work that they're doing to get Matt Friedman what he needed, for instance, to become probably the best in non-governmental intelligence service in all of Southeast Asia around this issue. By doing that, then, we hopefully shorten the curve for the philanthropists. I think it's on the back end as well. My sister emailed me over the weekend. She's on a grant panels for the Minnesota Women's Foundation, which typically has done domestic violence work, has done women's health, et cetera. They put out a series of small grants last year as part of a thing that they call Minnesota Girls Are Not for Sale. We helped with the launch of that at the University of Minnesota. We brokered some relationships with them. But they now have gone out and done a series of small grants, maybe 50,000 around Minnesota. This week, the St. Paul and Hennepin County DA's office and police were able to arrest 5 traffickers and, more importantly, free 10 girls as young as 14 from the pimps, because this relatively small philanthropic organization had done a relatively small grant that enabled the police to go back and say, we've looked at trafficking in a new way here in 2013. But in 2010, we weren't looking at it that way. We thought that these girls were criminals. We said, hey, look, there's a child prostitute. And so they went back, and with a relatively small grant, they were able to go back and reassess all of the cases that they had overlooked over the last few years. And from those now, they're realizing that these predators are out there. Those 10 girls would not be freed from their pimps if it hadn't been for the partnership that the Minnesota Women's Foundation was able to have with government. And I think that that's maybe a new way of thinking of philanthropy. We often think that in the human rights field that it's human rights activists and police, and the job of the human rights activist is to watch the police, and that's the only thing that we can do together. But there are some areas in which we can actually carve out that relationship.
No, I think that's right, and actually it reminds me of the Partnership for Freedom, which is an initiative that the Obama administration has kicked off to really begin to integrate public services in the U.S. at least around the housing, comprehensive case management, law enforcement initiatives, and also to bring together both public and private donors, which, as you say, typically have not, co-funded in these ways, and these services have been segregated. So if you're on the end of receiving services, the integration of those doesn't exist for the survivor of the trafficking practices. And I know that you've influenced that, that approach significantly under your leadership.
Thank you.
Pam, let me turn to you. And so, Pam, you and I have known one another for many years now, and I had the benefit early on, as I mentioned, to join up with Pam and Pierre when they were beginning their philanthropic work, and just beginning to think about what they as a family wanted to do, and particularly you, Pam, what you wanted to engage in. And there were a number of different areas that you could have focused on. And we could tell many somewhat humorous stories about me running off and bringing back ideas, and you saying, no, that's not it, keep looking. And what I found really interesting is that as a portfolio of activity, you decided to choose perhaps two of the most difficult things that that could be done, but two of the most challenging things that we should do. So you decide to begin to look at ways in which we can introduce more peaceful environments into conflict, and then also to tackle this issue of modern day slavery. Tell us why, what was behind that? What led you to really want to look at the slavery issue in particular?
Sure. Thanks, and Randy, I just want to take this opportunity publicly to thank you for this partnership we've had over these years, but also to Jacqueline and Lou. None of this, it's been an incredible journey since Pierre started eBay, since the company went public, and I went from being a graduate student in plant molecular genetics to then being, a management consultant for the pharmaceutical industry, looking at drugs and development, to then saying, wait, we have a moment in time now where we actually have to look way ahead, and how are we going to be stewards of this incredible wealth, which we certainly weren't raised with, we certainly weren't expecting, and so way back in '99, I think. Really just having sort of our family values and the things that Pierre founded eBay on notions of people are basically good, that if you create an environment of trust, people will do the right thing, that if you create an environment where people can communicate, and in this case it's around an economic transaction, but around anything, that you will get good outcomes. And I think if you combine that with sort of the passion of mine, from even being a scientist, I wanted to cure cancer. I was fourth grade, obsessed with the Holocaust and the notion of evil, and I went into science. But it's interesting that looking back, you can now say, well, we focus on issues of genocide, mass atrocities, and mass violence, and how do we create environments where those just aren't permissible. But so armed with this notion that, we're going to work to alleviate suffering and maximize human potential, and that, wow, we can do this, a whole lot of confidence going into it. But what were we going to do? We started working with the Omidyar Family Foundation, which then became Omidyar Network, started Hope Lab, which was around how do you improve adolescent and young adult people fighting cancer. How do you get them to make better decisions around their adherence to cancer treatment so that their outcomes are better? And that was actually the tool we were using was a video game, which, so a tech approach, but really getting at the underlying, human motivations. How do you change people's behavior in a really positive way? But during that time, and also during that time, we were, starting a family and living in France. And I remember being very excited when you come across English magazines, because you're trying to just immerse yourself in French culture. And reading an article in National Geographic about modern-day slavery, and these numbers going around was 27 million, huge numbers around the planet, and almost no country was exempt from this. And I thought, well, that is not possible. And yet, life goes on. We're working on remission, working on the Family Foundation, and about a year goes by, and I remember coming across another article on it, which had the same statistics, and thinking, wait, a whole year has gone by, and this has not crossed my path again. And this is of a scale that is unfathomable. And the more you learn and the more you get curious about it, the more you realize just how heinous slavery is, and the control of another person, and their inability to actually have any access or opportunity to the decisions that they want to make for themselves and for their children. And so at the same time, we're doing Omidyar Network, which is about access and opportunity, and not about, as a philanthropist, us controlling what that is, but saying how do we create environments for which people get to choose what they want to do, but we can enable environments which make that conducive and make that possible. So we were looking at microfinance and land rights and sort of a broad spectrum. But I kept coming back, and this is where Randy was working at Omidyar Network then. I kept saying, God, if you're enslaved, that you do not get this opportunity to be a woman who will get a microfinance loan. And so we started researching it and just saying these are, to use sort of market term, these are barriers to entry to all those positive economic development approaches that we want to do. And then also in 2004, we early 2004 found out about what was going on in Darfur, and that hit me very hard personally, because when you start researching it, I was thinking, wait, no, what do you mean genocide? This is not possible. And again, keep in mind, I'd been in the laboratory, very immersed around, DNA and cloning genes, and I wasn't paying attention to the broad world. And when I found out what we were doing while the Rwandan genocide was going on, 10 years before, Darfur, 9 years before Darfur, we were watching O.J. Simpson's truck, go down the road, and we weren't paying attention to Rwanda. And so at that point, I think a lot changed. Everything changed, and we said, what are we doing to each other as human beings? There's so much human potential out there, and why are we not using a lens of, when we make a decision, why isn't it about what is best for human development and not about, the destruction or control of another person? So that's how Humanity United was born. Just grateful for everyone. I know there's some HU folks here, but grateful for everyone, all our foundations that actually helped shape the emergence of our work.
Give us a little bit more color, though, sort of the looking at the underlying approach that you arrived at after studying this subject for quite a while. And What's the underlying approach that we're aiming to achieve through Humanity United on the work on slavery?
Sure. So much for passing it around. Well, basically it's, I think I view myself as a philanthropist as knowing the absolute least amount compared to anyone else that we work with. I mean, certainly compared to our grantees, certainly, when we were sitting in a refugee camp in Chad in people's homes, I know the least. And certainly, when we're talking to victims of trafficking and torture and so everything we do, I think I view it as we must be in partnership with everybody. And I think all of our organizations take a view that change isn't going to happen through one silo. It's actually going to happen through public, private, and social sectors working together. And it's going to take us collaborating with as many people as we can. So when we talk about technology, just real quick, it's not just about connecting. It's actually how do we use technology to deepen the relationships that we have and that we make and that we will continue to make, and how do we I'll just riff off John Paul Lederach's new book, because it's incredible, but it's, how do we sort of create a container and then expand and deepen relationships, and that's actually how we're going to get the change, because I think we operate in one that it is mission above organization. Mm-hmm. It is mission above any one ego, and so knowing that we can actually all focus on this big goal and then make incremental progress towards it.
Perfect. Thank you. Lou, let me come back to you, and I want to pick up on this question around the role that philanthropy can play in these gaps between policy and practice. And you sort of sit in this gap, helping to shape policy, and then obviously on the front lines of helping to fund practice. And talk to us about your experiences in that position and what you think that role is.
I think that one of the things is that when we look at philanthropy and we look at the desire of the philanthropic community in recent years to always be on the cutting edge, we have to balance that with the fact that there are also things that just need to get done. So for every project that we end up looking at that seeks to develop a global database on victim care so that we can figure out how to best deliver care to victims in their home country, in a country they may have been trafficked to, if they're male versus female victims, how do we capture their stories? How do we move past our assumptions into having something that's truly reflecting the voice of the victims? Something that's that cutting edge, you can start getting into notions of big data, or you can start looking at it as a army of sociologists out talking to folks. We can do that, but then there still needs to be somebody that's opening a shelter for the 200 child soldiers that we were finally able to get demobilized from the Chadian army or from the folks in the Eastern Congo. And I think that that's one of the challenges. We have about $18 million in my office that we can make grants in a given year. And again, that's about the size of one project for cocaine eradication. So I think it says a little bit about kind of where Congress and others are. We are not going to be able to keep the shelters open, much less do the innovation, if it only comes down to the U.S. State Department's funding for fighting human trafficking. And so we've had to make some tough choices as far as, how much do we have for the day-to-day funding of those projects versus disruptive technologies and other things that really then try to attack the information gap between trafficker and trafficked victim. If you look at the anti-trafficking books and plays and other things from the 1890s, when this was a very big social movement, it was all recognizing that the traffickers had more information than the victims did. Mm-hmm. Somebody comes to your shtetl in Eastern Europe and says, you can come to the United States and get a great job.
Yeah.
I know how to get you onto a steamship. And there's this place called Chicago where there's all these wonderful jobs as a maid. And instead, the girls end up in high-volume immigrant-serving brothels in the meatpacking district. Almost exactly what's happening to women from Tlaxcala and other parts of Mexico now. Well, in both the 1890s and now, it's because the traffickers have more information. They had more information about how to get to the United States, what the opportunities were, and then once here, how you can deal with that. So we're constantly wrestling with this challenge of how do we, on the one hand, fund the shelters, the victim care, the things that truly are going to get food into the mouths of the trafficking victims around the world, while then at the same time trying to disrupt that difference in information that the victims and the perpetrators have. I think to do that becomes the companies, so Sabre, Carlson, some of the other travel companies, working on that angle, working with governments as far as what kind of information should people have before they travel, and then working with other donors and the tech community and everyone else to try to make sure that we can address that, hopefully prevent it from happening in the first place, but then whether it's through SMS, whether it's through something that's as low-tech as radio, which often is the only access to information the trafficking victims have, might be radio. So how do we find that and then link it up with the lives of the victims? And I think that's the biggest challenge. A lot of it does all come back to data, because unless we start listening to the victims, we're not going to know where those interventions are and how to strike that balance.
But you're talking about this balancing both innovation and practice part of it in terms of the day-to-day. But your office was sort of existential in terms of supporting the slavery footprint, which is a really unique technology intervention and a data intervention, frankly, that's more on the consumer choice side of the proposition, that's much further upstream and could potentially provide massive disruption in terms of the marketplace. And so this is an example, though, where you have been willing to really invest time and thought and energy on the tech side innovation.
Well, we're certainly willing to do that, and I think that the slavery footprint, if folks haven't taken it, it's slaveryfootprint.org. I think we're going to talk about it this afternoon. But it really does look at your individual purchasing, your individual consumption, and then gives you a rough estimate of how many slaves does it take to sustain your lifestyle. I think that what happens when people take that is, it hit home for me, even though I've been working on these cases for years, and to see that number on a computer screen and say, those are my personal slaves out there. What can I do even more to try to bring that down? If it hit home for me and I'm in the movement, think about people who are coming to it for the first time. But again, that's, I think, a perfect example of how we're trying to be angel investors and provide seed and everything else. We were able to support that in its infancy, continue to support it, but Google and others have been able to come in and help take that to the next level. And that's, I think, where we really see ourselves. This is, I think, a different approach than either the Bush or the Clinton administration had to what money we were spending on human trafficking. For us, it's really trying to get the organizations to a level that they can then fly.
Yeah. Jacqueline, let me turn to you and maybe continue this theme around technology. And you sit in a really unique spot down there in Mountain View and have ambitious engineers that have time allocated to innovate, outside the scope of Google's main business line.
Yeah.
And talk to us about what you're seeing coming down the path around human rights and maybe in particular around the slavery space.
Sure. So we were talking about how, a recurring theme here is that the traffickers are using technology a lot of times more effectively than the response. And, Thorne recently did a survey of underage sex trafficked girls in the US, and 3 out of 4 of them said that they were either advertised or sold online. So I think we need to be very aware of what's happening online, what's happening through technology, and use technology to fight it. As I said, the internet's been a great force for economic impact, but those same forces have driven the price down as well. So Kevin Bales, for example, did research showing A slave in the early 1800s cost about $40,000. Today it's less than $100. So when slavery is that diversified and spread so much throughout the world and moving so quickly, technology is really going to be the key lever in fighting it. So I think there's some really exciting work going on around the world in this issue. With Google engineers in particular, we work with Newcomb, for example, to help them. I mean, they're just being overwhelmed by child pornography and other images and video that's proliferating on the web. The amount that's being sent to them, being reported and sent to them by tech companies is just escalating. And so Google and other tech companies have been working with them to think about how can we create visual search systems that will help identify and look for patterns and make it a more robust response than just humans looking at these images and trying to respond. I think there's also some really interesting technology work going on in terms of rescue and response. We saw the Fab Labs earlier, and there was an article this week in a scientific journal about micro drones that look like basically the size of little dragonflies. And these drone technologies can be very scary, but they're tools and they can be used for good or for ill. And I was thinking, one of the things that I learned when I lived in India and was looking at this issue a bit was that, the power a lot of times is just the secrecy. When you have slaves in a brick kiln in India, you own that private property, and it's very difficult to get anyone in. And right now they rely on trained investigators to go in surreptitiously with cameras and whatnot to gather the evidence and the footage to not only do rescue, but then to prosecute the bad guys and set up a credible deterrent. Well, what if you were able to use micro drones to go in to some of these hidden places and see what was happening and report that way? So I think there's some promising trends.
It's fascinating. Pam, you actually just wrote a piece in the Huffington Post a couple of weeks ago talking about the use of technology as well. And you were pointing to both an intentionality and I think building off some themes that Jacquelline has raised here, sort of this intentionality and kind of the sort of platform, if you will, of technology, and that platform being a values proposition that we should pay attention to. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I think, and Jane mentioned it this morning, that technology it's neutral. It's the sort of intention behind it. I think the point of that little piece in Huffington Post was around technology is part of the set of tools that we're using to address this issue, but as everyone said here, it's also used to keep the hideousness of slavery hidden. Yeah. Right. And so when Kevin was one of the first researchers to try to start documenting this, and I know the ILO has. I know Siddharth Kara has done a great job looking at the sort of statistics and the economics around this, and Mark Latanero, who I think is here from the Annenberg Center, wrote this great piece around this report around how technology is being used, both within trafficking by traffickers, but also to fight it. And I made a note about he sort of said around the intentionality. So I'm kind of skipping the op-ed piece, but that tech must be used in service to the victims of trafficking and also to prevent future victims. And I thought that was a really important piece. And then the second point, he had several, but the other point that really resonated with me, but it must be used to coordinate, collaborate, and expand, access, not just for people who want to work on solving this challenge, but also access to people who don't have voice, and giving them access so they find a way to have a voice to say this is actually going on with me, and for them to know that it's actually not okay. I think just in all of our work, this notion of being forgotten I think as in human nature, the notion that you're either unforgiven or forgotten is probably the worst feeling that you can have as a human being. So, Elie Wiesel writes about that in Night that he wrote about his experiences, this notion of being forgotten. And so I think we're actually trying to use technology to say, no, we don't want anyone to feel like they're forgotten, that they always have a path to go to. So.
And I think we've talked about this before, but even one of the most striking and kind of startling realities out of the development of eBay was the ability to provide access to individuals who were either disabled or didn't have market access that was so profound in the ways at which it transformed and changed those individuals' lives. And I think this is the benefit that technology provides us, in which we're speaking here to today. Lou, I want to turn to you perhaps for a final thought. And you have been somebody who has been just an absolute inspiration to a movement of abolitionists. And it feels like we're at this really unique kind of moment in time. And we were celebrating this last week in the Google offices in DC, and you provided some really reflective comments about this kind of moment in time that we're at. In particular, the symbolism of being 150 years plus, after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Give us your sense. You sit in this role where you get to see a lot of things taking place globally that are unique to the trafficking movement. What's your sense of the trajectory that this movement is in right now?
I think that the counter-trafficking movement is at a bit of a crossroads. And I think that, we've seen throughout the last 150 years, just in the United States, we tend to see spurts of activity that then drop off at the end of a presidency. And I know it might be a little soon since we just celebrated an inaugural after a re-election to start worrying about those things. But we've been able to successfully break that cycle over the last 12 years. Instead of, after the Grant administration had to pull the occupying soldiers out of the South and a wave of re-enslavement happened under the guise of sharecropping, instead of, after the Roosevelt administration gave way to a Southern Democratic administration as far as Wilson was concerned, and all of the good work of the Roosevelt administration against both sex trafficking and labor trafficking was put on the shelf. We were able to see George Bush pick this up from the Clinton administration and intensify it. We're able to see Barack Obama taking this from the Bush administration and intensifying it. I think we're at that moment where this can now become something that is part of our lives. The fight against trafficking, I think in the philanthropic space, we often see it as something that, my foundation does agriculture, or the foundation, what we're funding is, poverty, or we're looking at water issues, we're looking at cook stoves, we're looking at all these things. Well, the one thing that is common to all of those is that women and girls who have to walk to get water are being kidnapped and enslaved in Africa. If you're working on agriculture, you have to factor in the fact that so much of the agricultural economy around the world, whether it's farm or fish, end up being tainted by slavery even now. The notion of democratization, the notion of rule of law, all of the projects that we work on are rendered useless if that access to the market, the market of freedom, if people don't have that to begin with, they're not going to be able to get the other things. There's a reason why the civil rights movement in the United States really didn't take off until the Supreme Court made the practice of debt bondage illegal in 1947. And after that, we then see a shift over to from 13th Amendment civil rights to 14th and 15th Amendment, what we think of as the civil rights movement, Brown versus Board of Education, et cetera, couldn't happen while people were still enslaved by the local county sheriff down south. So I think that notion of it being a predicate to freedom. One quick war story. I was in I was in Rangoon about 3 weeks after Hillary Clinton, when we were opening up the relationship with Burma, and going in to see Aung San Suu Kyi in the house in which she had been held captive for 12 years. And walking in, and she had all of the training materials that the International Organization for Migration, UNODC, some of the foundations, et cetera, had been using, all tabbed and cross-referenced and everything else, and started asking me some very tough questions about the anti-trafficking work that was being done. And when I told people about that, I think a lot of people are surprised because they think of Aung San Suu Kyi as a democracy hero, or they think of her as a human rights champion, or this or that. Well, she spent her money, her prize money from the Nobel Prize. She had her husband take it to Thailand and pay for food, clothing, and shelter for 100 trafficking victims that World Vision had rescued. While the first trip that she took after she was let out of house arrest was to the shrimp packing sheds in Burma, or excuse me, in Thailand, where the Burmese are held in slavery to produce shrimp for the US market. And the last thing that she said to me before I left that day was, you really need to make sure that they let General so-and-so work on this. And I said, well, who's he? He said, he was my jailer. And he would bring me copies of articles from the internet about human trafficking. And over the last 12 years, we decided that he'd write a book on human trafficking that would reflect what he and I had talked about. And now that Burma is in a different place, we can work together in a very different relationship. And to me, that notion of her being able to say, this man who was assigned by the secret police to hold me in prison was someone who, because of the plight of the enslaved Burmese, that she could make that connection with. And then actually, rather than condemning him to me, recommending him to me as somebody who's a partner, that tells me that this sits at the confluence of everything we do. And the fight for freedom is something that can bridge even the gap between an Aung San Suu Kyi and the Burmese general who's confining her to her house.
It's powerful.
Wow.
It's a powerful story, and I appreciate your sharing that. And I think that helps us really wrap up the challenge that we have before us and really the hope that's provided for us in this movement. Before I ask you to show your thanks to our panelists today, I want to let you know that we have a very special treat this afternoon. Peter Buffett will be coming to perform immediately following this panel. Peter's an author, an Emmy Award-winning musician, as well as the co-founder of the Nova Foundation. He has also collaborated with Grammy-winning artist Angelique Kidjo, who will be speaking to us later in the conference on human rights-inspired songs. Peter will be performing Blood into Gold and Silence is Broken. He will also be accompanied by the cellist Michael Cott. There'll be a quick set change here before we pivot to that, and lunch will immediately follow. But please join me in welcoming and thanking our panelists this afternoon.